Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the GVP 8 Installation and Configuration Conference Call. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. At that time, if you have a question, please press the 1 followed by the 4 on your telephone. If at any time during the conference you need to reach an operator, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, December 6, 2012. I would now like to turn the conference over to Keith Jones, Genesis Support Tier 3. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the December 2012 tech tutorial. Today's topic will be GVP 8 installation and configuration. Our Q&A chat session will be managed by Surrender, so if you have any questions during the presentation, he will be answering them. We have a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time, so we will have to wait till the end for question and answer sessions. So let's begin with the agenda. So we're first going to start about the pre-installation setup, which will be basically everything you have to get done before you start deploying GVP. Next, we'll be talking about uploading all the GVP software to the Genesis administrator so we can deploy it later. We will then move on to deploying the media server, which is basically the resource manager and the media platform. We will then convert this to GVP by adding the reporting server. I talk about some of the other components that we can install. There's a section on installing multiple MCPs, which is useful if you have to use the GVP interpreter, since that is not supported on 8.15. So you have to have a mix of 8.14 and 8.15, which moves on to the mixed version of MCPs. I will be talking about the NLB version of the Windows High Availability Resource Manager, a bit about the High Availability Reporting Server options, some other information about Linux, as most of this presentation is fairly Windows-centric. And then we list some of the other resources and have our question period. So start off with what is GVP. It's basically everything in the blue box. So the core components are the resource manager and the media control platform. You can also add other things like CTI connector, MRC proxies, call control platform, policy servers, PSTN connectors, reporting server, whatnot. So we won't be talking about how to install the other stuff. So basically, we're expecting you to have SIP server and your gateways and speech resources sort of set up. So this tutorial assumes that we've got your framework set up, your Genesis administrator running, which you'd technically need to actually install framework. You've got your SIP server, IVR server, stat server, URS, and all that other stuff. That's not GVP. You should have your OS already installed for the servers where GVP will be deployed. You should have a database ready for your reporting server. Currently, we support Windows or Microsoft 2005 and 2008, along with Oracle 10 and 11G and the RAC version. You should have Java installed on your reporting server, and if you decide to install your policy server, you should also have it installed there. The version of Java that you should be using is corresponds to whether you're using a 64-bit or 32-bit version of the reporting server software, rather than what the actual OS is. You should also have the latest GVP software from the support site. You should have any speech resources installed, and you should have your web application server for hosting voice XML applications or TCP applications, or even announcements if you plan on using one of those instead of a local file system. So as part of the framework installation that should be done beforehand, you should have your LCA and Genesis deployment agent up and running on the systems. Here's a list of the servers we will be using in this particular tutorial. They're all sort of named after what will be installed on them. And as you can see, I've got a mix of 2003 and 2008 servers, and all their IPs are set up. few things that you should make sure that you do before installing everything. One is if you happen to be using, have a high usage of MRCP2 resources, you may want to lower the TCP time wait delay. Basically with TCP, once you finished with a connection, if or the OS will keep the actual TCP port in use until a certain timeout. So lowering this will allow you to basically have a higher volume of MRCP2 calls. Also note that if you have NLB, high availability resource managers, that you do require 2 NICs per server, not just one. And one thing we've noticed is that sometimes on 2008, dump files don't get generated if the application exits unexpectedly. So there's a link here of how to make sure that Windows will generate the dump file. The deployment manual or deployment guide mentions the Windows services settings. For the most part, these are already set to the recommended setting. The ones in red are the ones that aren't. So now that we've got all our pre-installation stuff, it's time to upload software to Genesis Administrator. So we log into Administrator, we go to the Deployment tab, and we can click on the Import button. This will open up a wizard, and we will be presented with 2 options. One is an entire CD-ROM, and the other is a single installation package. So to start off with, we will be going for the entire CD-ROM. There are 2 for GVP. One is the Media Server CD, which has the MCP and the Resource Manager. And then there's a GVP CD that contains pretty much everything else. You do have to enter a UNC formatted path, so you can't use file references. Typically, I will copy the software over to the Genesis Administrator server and then share the folder that they're stored in. So in this case, this is my framework system. I'm sharing with the Genesis software directory, and then the 2 CDs are under these 2 paths. So once we fill this in, we click Next, and we are presented with a large list of software that we can upload. You only need to upload the software you're actually going to be using. So you have a mix of Linux and Windows, both 32-bit and 64-bit. I'm going to be using a 64-bit version on my Windows 2008 server for Resource Manager. I've also got a mix of MCPs, so I've uploaded both of those. This is what you'll see for the GVP CD, and it has basically everything else. So again, you pick whatever OS-specific versions you want to upload. You will probably want to install the latest hotfixes as well. For the most part, the MCP and the Resource Manager are the ones that are hotfixed somewhat frequently. So you should check the release notes for the latest versions of those. The other ones not so much, but there are still hotfixes you may want to install. In this, you still need a UNC formatted path, but you have to supply both the installation package directory and the templates directory. For the most part, software that you download from the support site will be a tar file or a zip file with these individual directories. So in this example here, I downloaded the IPVP Media Control 64 E15 whatever package. When I extracted it, it gave me an IP and a templates directory, so those are the ones I'm listing. Once you fill that in, click Next. You have to pick the XML template appropriate for this package. This one happens to be the Media Control Platform one. You notice it has not only the actual Media Control thing, or Media Control XML file, but a large list of the speech resource ones. You only have to select the Media Platform one. The Resource Manager similarly has multiple XML files, I believe it's the resource manager and the recording server XML files. You only need the resource manager version. Everything else should be just the one XML file. So once we've actually uploaded all our software, the deployment tab should look something like this, with a list of all the software that we've uploaded. In this case, we've got CD-specific ones and the individual packages we've uploaded. In this case, I've also uploaded 814 single package versions of the media platform and the PSTN connector, as these are not supported on 815. So now that everything is in our deployment manager, we can actually start deploying stuff. So we are going to begin with installing the resource manager as part of the media server. So we pick the package you want to deploy, in this case, the latest hotfix of the resource manager for the version that I want. It's 2008 64-bit. And we click on Install Package. We will be presented with a wizard that has various steps. So you fill in your application name. It can be pretty much whatever you want. And you have to pick the target host. You'll note that while my server list was somewhat larger earlier on in the initial pages, we've only got 3 listed here. That's because this will only list the servers that will correspond to the actual version of software we're deploying. Moving on to the next tab, we have some of the basic parameters that you have to fill in. So one is the working directory. This can be pretty much whatever you want. I just typically stick stuff under program files, GCTI, and then the GVP path corresponding to the actual software I'm deploying. You can also configure this for client-side connections. For the most part, you won't need this, but if you have, say, a firewall that will only allow connections across certain port ranges, you may want to make sure that your component will connect only from a specific port. Moving on, we have to configure a default listening port. I believe for the most part GVP doesn't really use this, but this should still be unique. So in this case, I picked 5001, as 5000 is typically used by the Genesis deployer. In the next slide, or in the next tab of the wizard, you are asked to add connections. In this case, you should be adding the message server and the SIP server to your resource manager. You will also eventually want to be adding the reporting server once we've got that installed, but it's not there yet, so we can't add it just yet. And optionally, you can add the SMMP master agent if you want. You will then be given a confirmation slide, click next, and you should see everything start deploying. Once that's finished, you click finish, and you have a resource manager installed. So these are some of the notable resource manager parameters. For the most part, ports won't conflict with other GVP software. So resource manager will use 5060 to 5067. CCP will use 5068. MCP will be 5070, whatnot. The only thing you might have to worry about is if you are installing a resource manager with a SIP server on the same system, as they will both be trying to use 5060 and 5061. So you will probably have to modify one of these two, or rather 3 parameters. A few other parameters to note. The resolve address for address of record matching. Basically, the resource manager will check the VIA header for an invite and try and match it to what it has in its logical resource group. If it matches, then it knows what to do with the call. For the most part, if you're using IPs in your VIA and IPs in your LRGs, then things are fine. But if your SIP server happens to send a host name, it will not match directly with the IP, in which case it won't know what's coming from that gateway. So you can change this to true if you want to avoid that. The proxy SIP MTU size, basically, for the most part, we will be using UDP packets for sending SIP messages. However, if the message size goes over 1,500 bytes, technically 1300 because we go by an offset of 200 from the actual configure. But UDP doesn't work over, or will split up packets that are larger than 1500 bytes. So in this case, we will switch to TCP. We have seen some issues with customers, typically ones that use load balancers that aren't expecting TCP, and we're only configured for UDP. So you may or may not want to increase the MTU size by a factor of 10 to make sure that all messages are sent over UDP. The one caveat is that since the packets are being split, they have to be reassembled at the far end. For the most part with Linux, this isn't an issue. And for Windows on the same subnet, this isn't an issue. However, if you have an MCP in one subnet and a resource manager in a second one, the packages may not assemble correctly depending on what your switch does with the packets. So you might want to test this out first. The local address parameters, this allows you to change the actual IP listed in the messages. So if you happen to have multiple network interfaces on your system and the default one that the RM picks is something you don't want to use, then you can switch it with this. I use a star here because it's in the various sections for the proxy, subscription monitoring, and registration or register. And finally, if you want your messages to be sent to your message server, you should be adding the network log sync. Just a quick note before we move on here. If you happen to be planning on installing high availability resource manager, you may want to do this now. The section's not until the end, but basically starting from this point, we will be referencing the IP of the resource manager. So if you use a single resource manager and then change it to a high availability, your IP will change, so you will have to go back and modify some things. So, fair warning. Also, GVP 815 does not currently support the GVPI or the PSTN connector. We can get around the 814 GVPI with multiple MCPs. However, if all your calls are coming into the PSTN connector, you should probably be installing an 814 MCP at this point. So now we're ready to deploy the media control platform. It's basically the same as before. We'll pick the package you want, click on install package, and we have the same basic screen. So you fill in an application name, pick the server you want to deploy it to. You'll be asked to fill in a few more parameters. So the working directory and the client-side stuff is the same as before. The install mode is whether or not using MULA or ALA audio files. MULA is typically North American and ALA is typically European, but I guess your mileage may vary depending on what your SIP endpoints actually use. The HTTP proxy is whether or not you want to install, whether or not you're planning on installing SQUID. For the most part, the fetching module on the MCP is good enough to do all the caching required. The only time you might want to use SQUID is if you happen to be using like hundreds of megs worth of video files. But other than that, I generally just don't select it. And of course, these are the parameters if you are using SQUID. And finally, usage of voice XML applications. If you're just using strictly a media server that doesn't do voice XML, then you can disable this, but this is a GVP installation, so you will want to enable this. Again, we have to fill in a default listening port. We also have to have connections. Again, you should have a connection to the message server. You can optionally have a connection to SNMP. I've enabled one this time. We will eventually be adding a connection to the reporting server, and you do not, I repeat, do not need a connection to the resource manager. Once the deployment's actually finished, there are some changes you should be setting. The route set parameters are basically what the MCP uses to send outbound calls to a resource manager. So this tells it where to go. In this case, my resource manager is on .11, so that's the parameters I filled in here. Notable parameters, again, MTU size. If you want to make sure that you're using UDP for everything, then you should increase it by a factor of 10. Logging, again, to the network if you want to have stuff go to your message server. This was added somewhere in the middle of 8.1.4. Basically, previously we would expose user data to the interpreter sessions from the actual subheaders, and you convert the actual header name to lowercase characters. So if you have an older application that is expecting everything in lowercase, then you might want to change this to true to do the old default behavior of converting everything. We also have a big list of ports. In this case, there's a lot more ports than on the RM. For the most part, you don't have to change any of these. However, if you have multiple MCPs, you will have to remove any conflicts. Similar to the RM, we have the option to change the ports or the IPs that the media platform exposes to the endpoints. So now that we've actually got this stuff configured, we need to be able to use it. So we have to create logical resource groups. We have to create 2 of them in this case. One is a gateway group, which will allow the resource manager to know where calls are coming from, in this case a SIP server, as well as an MCP group, so it actually knows where to forward stuff. So in the provisioning tab, under voice platform resource groups, we will click on new, and we will get another wizard. So in this case, you have to select the resource manager or resource managers that are being used. This is a gateway group. And with gateway groups, you have to create a single gateway group for each resource manager, as opposed to the other types of LRGs, which you will add multiple resource managers for the same LRG. So in this case, we have just the one RM. If you've already installed high availability, you basically go over this again and do one for the other RM. You can fill in whatever group name you want. The group type, in this case, is gateway. Monitoring method, basically, this allows the resource manager to send SIP options messages to whatever the resource is, in this case, your SIP server. It's not really required, but you can do it to make sure that the resource manager knows that your gateway is up. Load balancing scheme, there are 3 options for this: round robin, just basically round robins amongst whatever resources it actually has. Least used is, as it sounds, whatever the actual least used resource is will be picked. And then there's also least percent, which will allow you to, if you have resources with different port limits, it will pick the one that's least used based on a percentage of their actual max limit. Geolocation allows the resource manager to pick an appropriate LRG based on geolocation header that gets sent in the invite. This is useful if you have basically multiple sites and you want to make sure that a media control platform is connected to a SIP server that happens to be in the same geographic location. Lastly, we have CTI usage. There are 3 options for this. The first is always off, which is the default, so that means no CTI is used. The second is based on DID lookup, so when the RM gets an invite from a gateway with this enabled, it will look at the IVR profiles to see whether or not it should be using CTI. And if it is, then it will send it to the CTI connector, and if not, then it will just send it to, the appropriate media platform. And you can also have it always on. If you don't actually have a gateway configured, the RM can't identify where it comes from, this will always be considered always off. So if your CT isn't working, make sure that the RM can actually identify where the call is coming from. And the last part of the wizard, you have to select whichever subservers you want, fill in an IP or host name, and the port. If you happen to be using high availability subservers, you only select one of the two, and you fill in the virtual IP and your host name. You can also limit the actual amount of ports that this particular gateway can handle. And redundancy is active versus passive. Passive resources will only be ever used if one of the active resources goes down. So now that we've got our gateway group created, we have to create one for the media control platform. So again, we will add a resource manager, or if we've already done high availability, we will add two of them. I've only got one currently, so in this case, you can name it whatever group you want. The media platform or media control platform group is a group type, and you are given a list of services this particular LRG will be able to support. Since this is our 815 MCP, we will be including everything. So from voice XML to MSML, you can actually create separate LRGs that only support certain services, which we will be using later with our 814, which will only support voice XML, since you want to be using 815 for pretty much everything else. You will be given an option to choose tenants if you happen to be using a multi-tenant server. Don't really have time to go over multi-tenancy in this particular tutorial, but you can basically limit this particular LRG to a certain tenant. We have the same monitoring method and load balancing geolocation as before. You can also add, for the MCP groups, some conference limitations, as well as set the service quality notification threshold. Basically, the reporting server keeps track of how long it takes things to get done. So however long it takes from the actual call to start to, say, play the first prompt, or how long it takes to fetch a certain page. And it has basically a threshold of how long is considered too long, and how many calls that go over this threshold will be considered bad. So we can set our own threshold here to start sending out alarms if something goes under the service quality threshold. And again, we have to select the resource assignments. In this case, I've got my first media platform. The IP should already be filled in, and you should have a drop-down box for the port, which in this case will be 5070. You don't need to fill this in unless you're actually using secure SIP. And again, the max ports and redundancy are the same as before. So now that we've got our LRGs created, we're almost finished setting up a media server. The last thing we have to do is create a default IVR profile. And so there are two ways of doing it. You can either use a wizard, or you can sort of manually create it. We're going to first start off with the wizard. So in the IVR profile section of the provisioning tab, we click on Define New IVR Profile. You basically supply an IVR profile name and then the service type. Since this is just a media server technically right now, the only two service types are announcements and conferences. In this case, I clicked an announcement and named my IVR profile appropriately. The only thing you really need to fill in is what announcement will actually be played. This particular audio file was just copied from the media control platform's default audio section and then stored on my web server. You don't have to fill in any of this stuff, but you can sort of add delays, limit the number of times it repeats, and add whatever virtual recording objects. But since this is just a default application that will only be played if the RM doesn't actually know what it should have done. You don't really need to add anything else, so you can click Finish. If you don't, you have some other things that you can specify in your wizard, like the max number of calls, although if this is your default, you probably shouldn't be limiting that. Again, with the service quality threshold, and if you happen to be using contact services, you can supply username and password for being able to log into that. You can also create one manually, so I didn't actually save that last wizard version. And in this case, we're going to be creating it manually, so I'm going to be clicking the New button rather than using the wizard. Similar to before, you basically fill in a name and display name in the Configuration tab. You move on to the Options tab, and you fill in two things: the service type, which we saw before was announcement, and your URL. So in this case, I'm actually referencing the file directly rather than copying it over to the web server. Note, though, that if you have a file-based reference, that any platform that can handle this request should have this file at the same directory. So you notice that my installation path for this was MCP 101A, so unless there is this particular directory on some of the other servers, then they won't be able to play it. The reason why I've suggested or shown how to do this manually, if you do have a file path and it does have spaces, the wizard does require you put %20 instead of the actual space, and the reporting or the resource manager doesn't quite like this as well as it should. There's an ER open for this. Hopefully it'll get fixed soon. So now that we've actually created our IVR profile, we have to make it default. So on our provisioning tab, we go to the tenant section. We find our current tenant, which in this case is environment, and we will edit it. And we will go to the options tab and add this particular parameter, in this case GVP general, default application, and the value is whatever we've named our announcement. In this case, it's default announcement. You will probably also want to be creating a VoIP service DN on your SIP server. So type is voice over IP service. Your name can be pretty much whatever. This is a suggested list of options. You don't have to go through this, or don't have to do this explicitly. And you probably don't need all of these, particularly for an announcement. But these can also be used for CPD later on with SSG, so I've decided to include all of them. Just a note that the tenant here should be tenant appropriate to what you actually have. And of course, if you happen to be using, or this is your IP for your resource manager, so this is currently my non-HA version, so I will have to change this later on when I move to a different IP for HA. And so now we've basically deployed a media server. At this point, you should actually be able to send calls to either just directly the resource manager with a SIP phone or a soft phone, and it should play that audio file. Or if you've got your routing point set up to actually handle stuff and play treatments, then it should be able to connect to the resource manager and play whatever treatment you want now. So now that's set up, we are going to be installing the reporting server and making this officially a GVP deployment. So in this case, we're using the default reporting server that comes on the GVP CD. Click on installation package, and again, we get to the wizard. So you fill in an application name and the target host. One suggestion here is that if you do plan on using a shared, not a segregated, but a shared high availability reporting server, you might want to set this to a generic name, just like reporting server, as eventually we will only be using a single application name for shared HA, or yeah. Again, there are a few more parameters that we have to fill in that are different from before. So you have to have Java installed, and you have to list the Java path. In this case, I was using Java 7 Update 9, and this is where the JRE file gets installed. You have to select your database engine. As I mentioned before, we support both Microsoft SQL and Oracle. So you basically pick one of those options. There is a distinguishing characteristic of either enterprise or standard. These don't actually correspond to the enterprise or standard versions, but rather represent whether or not partitioning is used. So if you are using partitioning or want to use partitioning, you will select enterprise. And if you do not wish to use partitioning, then you will select standard. There's also a NodeDB option that you can put in here, which will allow you to have, I guess, real-time information reported, but no historical data. But I won't really be talking much about that. So I will be using Microsoft SQL 2008. I will be using partitioning, so again, enterprise. The host is basically where the actual database is located. If you are using shared HA reporting, the database should be offboard. If you happen to be using instanced versions of the database, you will include that instance name into this section here. So you have /2 or .2/instance1 or whatever. The typical ports are 1433 for MS SQL or 1521 for Oracle, although there's no guarantee that your ports will be default, depending on what your database administrator actually sets up. I have to supply the database name, which is VPRS, or that's what I'm using. This will be the schema name, I believe, in Oracle, and you have to supply the username and password to connect to the actual database. Lastly, there is two ports. One is the port that the reporting clients will connect to. So your MCP will try and connect to port 61 and 616 on the reporting server, so it can send all of its data to a reporting server. There's also web service port, which is where the reporting server handles web request queries. This is what Genesis administrator will contact. You can also do manual stuff and get XML results back if you want to, I guess, customize your own reporting. Again, fill in the default listing port. I think it defaults to 8080, so we're just leaving that. You don't actually need any connections. You can add a connection to the SNMP master agent, but it's not a requirement. Once you are finished deploying, you will have to configure your actual database. So where the software is deployed in the scripts directory, there will be a partition type directory, so either standard or enterprise. So depending on what you actually selected earlier on, you will select the correct directory. And there will be a list of scripts in there that you need to install based on whether using MS SQL or Oracle. So enterprise was the version we were installing, and I'm using MS SQL, so this is the schema that I am running. There's also a similar one for Oracle, and I believe actually a lock tables SQL that you'd be running after typically. This is just screenshots of basically how you'd set this up with MS SQL. So in the Management Studio, you'd open the SQL file with a new connection. So this is the file that I want. This is the connection that I want, which is my database. Once that's loaded into the correct, or once this is loaded up, you basically click execute and your table structure is done. Some notable parameters. So the persistence hibernate remote database. If you happen to be using Oracle RAC, basically you mix this parameter with the with the hibernate remote URL parameter and send connection request to Oracle. However, Oracle doesn't like that, so you should be blanking this out if you're using Oracle RAC. and that should allow your connections to be working correctly. This is the retention section. There's a whole bunch of different parameters here that you can retain how long data is kept for, basically in 5-minute, 30-minute, hourly, daily, weekly, and monthly data. We keep the shorter time period data for a shorter period of time, so your 5-minute data will probably only be there for maybe a day, whereas your monthly data will be there for at least years. So if you happen to be trying to get 5-minute data from 2 months ago, it won't be there, although you'll have daily data from 2 months ago. You can tweak this if you want, but again, if you want to keep more data, your database size will increase. The latency section, this is basically the service quality stuff we were talking about before. Basically, there's a big list of thresholds. If a certain action takes a certain amount of time, and this happens to be longer than the threshold, then that will be considered bad. And then this is paired with a second parameter of how many actual, or what percentage of calls can go over this threshold before you start sending out alarms. You can configure the username, hostname, port. This can allow you to basically restrict access to your reporting web service. However, if you do add a username and password, you do have to make a similar change to your default application object, which will be trying to connect to the web service. It should be the rtpui.username and password, which you fill it in your default application object. And again, these are the ports we talked about before that the clients connect to. And lastly, not a requirement, but the default time format is time, which just logs hours and minutes, which does make reading log files a bit more difficult if you have to go to a certain date. So we do suggest you change this to ISO 8601, which includes the actual day. Now that we've actually deployed and configured our reporting server, we do have to add connections to that reporting server that we didn't get to add before. So we need to add a connection to the reporting server from the MCP, the resource manager, and the actual default application object, or whatever application object you use to connect to Genesis Administrator. For the most part, these will be in the applications directory. The one exception is the MCP, which will be under its own folder based on the actual LRG that it's in. So you use the drop-down box, find your MCP, and open the actual application object. In the General tab, you go to the Connections, click Add, and add the reporting server, and save and close when you're done. Now that we have, I guess, officially decided to create a GVP installation, we should probably change our default IVR profile to something that actually does voice XML. So in this case, we're creating a new IVR profile called default voice XML that will actually be of service type voice XML. You only need to fill in your initial page URL. I should leave the interpreter as next generation, as 815 does not support the legacy interpreter. In this case, I've copied the box TTMF voice XML file from the samples directory in the media control platform. You can actually use the file reference directly, but again, spaces need %20, which the ARM doesn't like. If you decide not to click finish and go through next, then you can actually add some other stuff. Basically, again, limit the number of sessions. You can prevent transfers and outbound calling. We'll get back to the CTI later, but for now, we will not be using CTI in this. If you happen to have your gateway set to, depending on DID lookup, this is what it will actually look at. There's also a dialing rule section, which you can prevent certain outbound calls. So if you have an application that will dial an outbound call based on user preference or based on user entered digits, you can stop it from, say, dialing 911 or 800 numbers or whatnot. Again, we have the service quality threshold policy and context services. You can also create it manually, similar to before, so we're calling it default voice XML still. And we have 3 basic parameters. The service type is voice XML. CTI allowed, this will be false. And this is the one that I was mentioning before. So if you set this to true, then this will go to CTI connector first, but we don't have that installed. And the initial page URL is whatever the initial page is. In this case, I've accessed the file directly in the default sample directory. We also have to edit the default IVR profile. So we go to our tenants environment, click edit. So we previously added the default application parameter. In this case, we're changing it to default voice XML. We save and close. And for the most part, GVP is set up. We should also, you can optionally create a DID for the actual profile. So in the DID group section, if you click new, you can associate the IVR profile with a specific DID. In this case, you just randomly pick 2000, and then select a name for your DID group. This way you can, once you've done this, you can actually call into 2000 and get that voice XML IVR profile. You can do this with any other profile, so you can create multiple ones and whatnot. I typically name it based on the actual DID and then the IVR profile name, but you can set this to pretty much whatever you like, as long as you can find out your stuff or find the correct DID groups to edit if you need. I should also be creating a trunk DN on your SIP server. So type trunk. In this case, we're just picking the number for GVP, and we need the contact. So you don't have to make a trunk DN. You can also use voice treatment ports, but this will basically allow you to call on the SIP server and basically have a straight pass-through to GVP, which will then figure out based on whatever DID you entered and pick whatever. So at this point, you should be able to make calls to GVP. Now that we've got this all set up, we can actually start adding some other components. The first is the policy server. This is optional. What this does is it sits between your Genesis administrator and your config server. And it has basically elevated privileges. So if you're trying to create DIDs or trying to assign DIDs to your IVR profiles, and you happen to be you have a limited sort of access to what you can see, this will then allow the Genesis administrator to ask policy server if there's actually any conflicts, and it will tell you that there are or are not conflicts when you try and create DID groups. Also, if you have large numbers of DID groups created, it helps with the organization. So if you happen to have, say, 50 different groups, and you pick a certain range that's already taken, this will tell you. So I've just simplified what we actually show. So when you're deploying the policy server, you have the same working directory and the client-side options. The web service port will default to 8090. Again, you do have to have Java installed. In this case, it's my Java path. And it will also ask you the version and the service pack. So I was using Java 7 Update 9. So version 7 corresponds to 170, and Update 9 corresponds to 9. You might as well use the listening port corresponding to the web service port, which is 8090. Connections. This doesn't really need connections to anything. You can add a message server. However, things do need a connection to this. So once you've actually deployed this, you have to change your default application object or whatever you're using to actually log into Genesis Administrator and add your policy server with the I button. Other components, speech resources. So this will be a two-step process. First, we have to upload the templates. So remember back in the start where I mentioned that if you have a single media platform, you're uploading it, it has the one media platform XML file. and a whole bunch of all the other XMLs for the resources, or speech resources, well, we're going to be using them. So we have to go to the application template section and click on Upload Template. It will then give you a little pop-up thing where you click Add for the correct APD file. And note these files will actually be the local file system, so you have to use, or you can't use UNC formatting. So here's my templates directory for my media platform software. Here's a big list. This one I'm picking is the Nuance MRCP v1. We support a variety of different ASR and TTS, and there are templates for them. So there's Nuance templates, there's IBM templates, there's Toolisma templates, and then there's your basic generic template, such as this one up here, which is just simple v1 TTS. In this tutorial, we'll be adding the MRCP v1 and v2 Nuance templates for both ASR and TTS. So, as I said before, this is the v1 TTS, which I'm starting off with. Once you've actually picked it, it will fill in a default name for you, the v1 TTS, and you will click on Import Metadata to add the actual XML file. Again, you get the pop-up asking for an XML file. You click on Add, and we will find the appropriate XML file. So the v1 TTS Nuance XML file is what we'll be using. I've basically done this for all four of them that I mentioned earlier, the Nuance v1 and v2 for ASR and TTS. So you don't get to see that, but now that we've uploaded all our templates, we have to create an actual speech resource. So in our application tab, I suggest you create a new folder to store your speech resources so they don't get sort of mixed up with everything else. Makes things a little bit easier. So I've created one called Speech Resources, and now that I'm actually in the speech resource folder, we can click on new create new application to actually create new speech resources. So in the wizard, we will click Browse for Template. We've already uploaded these templates, so you notice there's the four that I've uploaded here. This example will start off with the v1 ASR. So we select that, click OK, click Next. And you will fill in a speech resource application object name. In this case, I've named it after the server that the speech resource is on, which is named GVP SRM 101. It's ASR, so I've called it ASR, and it's a v1 resource, so I've added v1. You have to fill in a host for some reason. I just picked the framework one. You can basically, if you want, you could add or set up LCE on your SRM server and actually pick that host, but it's not going to be required. On the next page, there is a checkbox. Leave this checked so you can configure the remaining configuration parameters once you've finished. And you have to do two things. So the page that opens up will be one that asks you to fill in the provision, client, or VRM client resource URI and name. These are the typical URIs that you use for Nuance. So RTSP for v1, SIP URI for v2. The names can be pretty much whatever you want. We don't recommend using the same name for ASR and TTS. So even though you're using Nuance ASR and Nuance TTS, which is just calling it RealSpeak or Vocalizer for your TTS. If you do have multiple speech resources that are all the same type, so if you've got 5 servers serving up ASR, all those would have the same resource name. You also have to add in a port for default listening. So you move on to the configuration tab, or move back to the configuration tab, add it in, and then you can click Save and Close. If you don't add this, it won't let you save it. So it's just a screenshot of what shows up. So we'll only show the mandatory options, and we fill in our URI and name. This is a TTS v2, so I fill those in accordingly. And you have to move from the options page to the configuration tab, go to your listening ports, click Add, and fill in whatever default listening port you want. Now that we've set this up, you also have to provision your MCP to actually use these feature resources. So you basically, as we've seen before, for adding connections to the reporting server, you will add connections to whatever speech resources you created. You should also set the default engine on your MCP to the actual name that you used for your resources. This may or may not cause problems if you don't do that, since it will try and open up a speech resource called default. Then it will open up a speech resource called nuance, and weird things have happened in the past, although I think we've got most of that stuff worked out. If you want, you can also change your IVR profile. So there are samples in the samples ULAW directory of the MCP platform that have voice XML. So the previous one, the Vox DTMF, was basically just enter or takes in DTMF input and plays audio files accordingly. There's also a TTS ASR VXML file that will do ASR and TTS. There's an ASR only one for Vox ASR, and there's a TTS only one for TTS DTMF. So this is a good way of testing to make sure your ASR and TTS are actually working. Moving on, another component is the proxy. So instead of having the MCP, which basically will round robin amongst all your speech resources, if you have multiple ends, you can connect to a proxy and let the proxy manage your speech resources. The parameters are basically the same that we've seen before. Connections, you should add a connection to the reporting server. The message server, you can add one to the SNMP if you have it. And you should also add connections to all your V1 resources. Note the MRCP proxy is only for MRCP V1, so don't add V2 resources as they won't work. You do have to make one configuration change, which is the VRM proxy URI parameter. Defaults to localhost, which will be fine if you actually have one MCP and your MRCP proxy happens to be on that server. But if it's off-board, you should be setting the IP. You can leave the default 1100 port or 11,000 port. You will also have to add the MRCP proxy application object as a connection to the MCP, and you should be removing all your old V1 resources. Next up is the call control platform. Again, this is an optional component. This is the call control platform basically handles CCXML pages similar to the way the media control platform handles VXML. CCXML is better off for handling connections, so if you're making conferences and I guess joining dialogues and whatnot, it's good to use. The parameters are basically the same, working directory, client stuff. Again, SQUID or not SQUID. In this case, we don't suggest using SQUID. Again, you don't need connection to the resource manager, but you should have one to the message server, the reporting server, and optionally the SNMP master agent. SNMP will give you some additional stuff or additional reporting information, as the reporting server can connect and find out file fetching data. Although again, that's optional. These are the parameter changes. So as with the MCP, it has to know where the resource manager is to send outbound calls. You should also be setting the subproxy and bridge server, which it uses for dialogues. That should be fairly straightforward. This also has the MTU size, which you can increase, although if you haven't done it on the RM, there's no point. Again, log standard, send that to network if you want to send stuff to your message server. There is a big list of audio and video codecs. Basically, call control platform uses an offer answer model for joining endpoints. So it can advertise a really large number of audio and video codecs. So if you're not actually using them, you might as well strip them out of here to make negotiation easier. So if you're just using EULA, there's no point in having PCM codecs. Also, if you're not using like AMR, wideband, and whatnot, remove that. Again, we have the typical ports that can be modified, as well as the actual IP, and again the SRV. Oh, I don't think I should have mentioned that. Sorry, I should have mentioned this before. So when you change the actual IP that's used, if you don't like what gets default or used by default, the SRV parameter will kick in if this is actually set. If it's set to true, then it will not add a port. So this is a problem for things like MCPs and whatnot that don't use 5060. So if you set this to some IP, leave this as true, suddenly you don't have a port set and everything gets sent to port 5060, which it's not listening on. Now that we've actually set up CCP, we have to create a logical resource group for it. Same as before. You go to the resource group section, click on new. You fill in your resource manager or resource managers if you set up HA already. The group type is call control platform. Again, you can set tenants if you want. Again, we recommend using least percent for the load balancing scheme, and you should be setting or be using SIP options to monitor the fact that the call control platforms are up. And lastly, you pick the actual resources that will be in this group. Set the IP and the port. Now we've created our LRG, we should create a CCXML IVR profile. So in this case, we go to our wizard, we'll define new IVR profile. Service type is CCXML, and pick whatever IVR profile name you want. In this case, I'm using getlog strings CCXML example that used to be on our old voice union support site. I think it was moved over with DevZone, but due to our recent, support site changes, it hasn't been moved over quite yet. So I've actually included the CCXML file and the corresponding dialog VXML embedded in the notes of this slideshow. So if you want to use something that does a quick dialog test, takes some DTMF and then sends it back to CCXML for logging, and then you can test it out with that. You can click finish, or you can click next and fill in, the typical stuff that we've seen before. But I'm not going to go over those. So we also have to create a DID for our IVR profile. I picked 4000. This is the IVR profile name, and this is some generic name that I've decided for my DID group. So at this point, I should now be able to call into 4000 at my SIP server, which I've used a trunk group, or just directly to the RM with 4000 at the RM IP, and I should get to my CCXML application. Moving on, CTI connector. There are two different framework modes. One is Genesis CTI, which is basically your IVR server. The other is using Cisco ICM, which I'm not really discussing in this presentation, as I don't really have anything to test it with. And it's not quite as common. Again, the standard connections apply, so you've got reporting server, message server, and optionally your SNMP master agent. Required changes, there is a client name, which is basically what the IVR group name shows up in your CME. And you also have your iServer address and socket, which is basically where the CTI connector connects to your IVR server. This is typically the GLI server address and port values. Some notable parameters. Again, time format doesn't default to ISO 8601, but if possible, please change this so that we get the actual date and the time. Get DNS from iServer. This basically decides whether or not the CTI connector needs to get the DNS from the actual IVR server. More often than not, that if something doesn't quite work from the get-go, this parameter probably needs to be changed. And again, we have the usual port values and IP values that can be modified from the defaults. You do have to create an LRG for your CTI connector. So again, add your resource managers. Pick the group type for CTI connector, set your tenant if applicable. We suggest using round robin for the load balancing scheme, and you pick your CTI connector that's being installed. Pick the port, and you can set whatever else if you need to. Setting your IVR profiles to actually use CTI. So assuming we still have that LRG gateway set to use CTI based on DID lookup, we basically create our IVR profile. This is manually, and we set CTI allowed to true. I happen to pick one of the default applications, so this was again the one that just requested DTMF and then played audio files that came with the samples directory. But if you're using the wizard as I pointed out before, you have to check this off, and you should be good. You will create a DID group, or sorry, a DID group associated with this. So I've added this for DID 7000. Assuming you've actually created your default or your appropriate DNs and IVR ports and whatnot on your SIP server, you should be able to call into 7000 and get CTI working. The call will actually go from the SIP server to the resource manager to the CTI connector, and then the CTI connector will actually make a second call leg and call the resource manager, which will connect to the media control platform. So you'll have two separate call legs, which you'll be able to see if this is working correctly. I think by default that if the actual CTI fails, the resource manager will just try the media platform directly. So even if your call gets answered, you might want to make sure that you have two call legs to make sure that things are actually working correctly. Next is PSTN connector. As I mentioned earlier, this is only supported on 814. So I did use the 814 package. The usual parameters apply, and the usual connections. In this case, you should actually add a SIP server connection as well, not just the reporting server, SNMP, and message server. Just a note that the SNMP will allow you to monitor the actual dialogic ports through Genesis Administrator, although it's still optional. SIP server, if you add the connection, then the PSTN connector will add a separate header that includes the trunk DN's prefix, so that you can actually find your way back if you have to make outbound calls to the same trunk. If you don't really have to worry about that, then I guess this technically would be optional. The required parameter changes, for the most part, they're dialogic stuff, but there are some other notable ones. So the root stuff is basically setting what your ports are, whether you happen to be using inbound or outbound calling, and the type of signal you're using, so ISDN versus ROB bit versus CAS versus whatever else. We don't really go over to this because it's fairly specific to the actual environment that's being deployed, and there are many different configuration options or ways to configure this. The gateway manager is where to get a hold of the SIP server to actually send calls. The PSTN connector doesn't connect to the RM. It will actually go through SIP server. And the RTP, local codec type, is just the default codec we're using, which is either ALAW or ULAW. A few other notable parameters, basically you can set the port and address, same way we have with other systems or other components. You should be creating a trunk DN on your SIP server. I've named this based on my prefix. You can name it whatever you want. These are the basic suggested settings, basic media contact, where it is. I've added a prefix. You can also add another parameter to strip the prefix out for outbound dialing. This is just the basics to get things up and running, and we leave the rest to tweak for you. Next is the SSG. There are basically two ways of configuring this, but the deployment is the same for both. So we picked same parameters as before. This does require a SIP server connection. And again, the usual reporting server, message server, and optionally SNMP connections. That's a fairly straightforward deployment. You can control the actual HTTP listening port, which is where you send requests to actually make outbound calls. Oh yeah, SSG is for outbound calling. I forgot to mention it. And you can set a dial prefix that will be prepended to your dial numbers that you call. There are two ways of configuring it, as I mentioned. One is trunk group DNs, which is fairly simple. Basically, you fill in the TGDN parameter with your tenant name. In this case, I'm using environment. If you're using a single tenant config server, then this would be resources. And if you happen to be using a tenant that's different than environment, then well, you fill in a different tenant name. You also have to create a DN trunk group. The name will be the tenant name that we specified in our TGDN parameter. And again, there's a big list of suggested parameters. The tenant name shows up here and somewhere at the end of the string. So if you're not using environment and you are using resources, it should be set here as well, or whatever tenant. And again, the contact is your resource manager. Basically, this will allow the SIP server to query the resource manager to see how many ports are available for actual outbound calling. If it doesn't do this, the SSD won't know how many ports are available, and it will not try and make outbound calls if it assumes there are none available. The second option, which I will only go over briefly, is route point DNs, which is typically used with CTI, I guess PSTN connector. Basically, you follow the steps you did before, so you still have to make the trunk group DN. You still have to fill in that parameter, which will allow, as I mentioned, the SSG to pull the resource manager for how many ports are available. But you also have to set a RPDN parameter, which will be the name of your routing point. That will, I guess, trigger everything. In this case, I've called it SSG RPDN. You name it whatever you want, as long as you actually have a route point of that name. So, briefly, you create the route point DN. You're supposed to create a VoIP service DN for call progress detection. We made that GVP VoIP service DN at the very start of this, so you can use that for this. It should work. I should also create a VoIP service DN for treatments, although I don't actually recall ever having used this DN. It only has two basic parameters. And then the funky part is you have to create a whole bunch of voice treatment ports DN. Voice treatment port DNs, associate them with IVR ports, have them in your place group so your stat server can pick that in your routing strategy that is loaded on that RPDN named strategy we mentioned earlier. But I'll leave that basically up to the user. Somewhat convoluted and depends on what sort of port ranges you want to use. So that's pretty much most of the other components we can install in a nutshell. Next topic we're talking about is having multiple MCPs on the same server. If you happen to be using an old, say, 2003 server with 12 gigs of RAM, and you can only use 3 gigs of that for each MCP, you're sort of wasting a lot of RAM. So you can have multiple MCPs on that server. Basically, you just deploy a second MCP on the same server. You have to make the route set changes we mentioned originally to point to the RM. And then we have to resolve the port conflicts. You can either go through that list that was mentioned earlier about all the different ports, or we can use a wizard for this. So basically, you have to find the MCP application object. So again, in the application tab, you click on the drop down, go to the group that has the MCPs, and you click on one of the MCPs. I haven't started the other one, so the other MCP hasn't been added to this group yet. And there's, I guess, a possibility that it won't be used for this particular LRG. It might be for something else. And in the right-hand pane, there is a Configure MCP Network Parameters option that will open up a wizard. The wizard looks something like this. You get big red exclamation points when things in this particular tab are overlapping with something else. They will go away once you've actually resolved it for that, and you will get red boxes around ports that conflict. So in the screenshot, I basically resolved all the ports for everything except for these two that are still using port 5070. And so you notice there's only the one exclamation point, and these two boxes are the only ones that are left. There is a button here that shows up here, listed here, that will allow the wizard to basically set everything by itself, or you can make changes manually if you want. What I typically do is I'll add 100 to each of the individual ports, so 5071 becomes 5171, 7080 becomes 7180. There's three sections of ports that have small ranges that typically go from about 10K to 15K, and there's a nice open space to have those similar ports go from 15K to 20K. So I typically add 5,000 to those smaller port ranges. And then there's the local RTP ports, which generally is 20K plus, so you have a wide range, and you can split that however you want. One caveat, a wizard does not change certain things, so it doesn't change your debug TLS port for some reason. So you will have to make this, or change this manually. It also doesn't change your VRM recorder ports, so again, changes manually. You might as well set it, or if you use what I suggested earlier, I picked 7190 and 7191 in the second MCP. And for some reason, we only changed the transport 0 and not the other two transports, so you will have to change those accordingly. There's an ER open for this, so hopefully the next version of Genesis Administrator might have a fix for this. Now that we actually have multiple MCPs, we should probably update our resource group to include the new MCP. So in our provisioning tab, we go to resource groups, we select our existing MCP group and click on edit. You can skip past pretty much everything and go directly to the resource assignment tab and basically select your new MCP, which was installed on the same server as the first one. Select the new port, as you mentioned before. I just add 100 to it, and you basically save and you are done. Next, we're moving on to mixed version MCPs. So as I mentioned before, 815 does not support PSTN connector endpoints, and it doesn't support the old legacy GVPI. So if you do want to have an 814 MCP kicking around to support either of these, then basically you will deploy it in the exact same way that we've deployed all our other stuff, and you will create a separate logical resource group for that particular MCP. And so in this case, I've named it 814 MCP group. And since I want my 815 stuff, or 815 MCP to be handling everything else, I've only selected voice XML since it will only be used for the GVP interpreter in this case. You do have to set capabilities, and to do this, we will be modifying the actual resource groups. So we have to find out the funky name that gets the funky folder name that actually holds these groups. So in our applications section, in our drop-down box, we have a big list. So these are the groups we have so far, and basically this GVP_69 blah 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 is the folder name we are looking for and we want to save. So once we've got this name, we go to our business unit sites section, and this happens to be that folder we were looking for. So if we double click on this folder, it will open up that particular folder, and we will see all of our LRG subfolders. We need to edit these. in particular the MCP group and the 814 MCP group, and add a capability parameter. So click on the MCP group, click Edit, and we will be adding in the Options tab a new parameter. In this case, it's called GVP LRG capability, and we have to supply a capability that this can do. I've called this interpreter, and my capability will be called interpreter, and this particular capability that is supported on this particular LRG is GVP 815. You could call it version, you could call it version equals 815, or you could basically name it whatever you want, but your requirements that we add later on should match whatever this capability is. You also do the same thing for that 814 MCP group, but in this case, I'm changing the capability requirement to GVP 814. So basically, when you add this, you'll be changing this to GVP 814. So now if the RM ever gets something with a request for a specific capability, in this case for interpreter, it will then be able to pick the appropriate LRG that has the media platforms that support it. So to actually make sure that the RM gets a requirement for the capability, we'll be modifying our voice XML files, or voice XML IVR profiles. So in this case, we go to the IVR profile section. We will edit one of our existing IVR profiles, and we will add a capability requirement parameter. So our default IVR profile, we want to make sure that it uses an 815 version of MCP. So our capability requirement will be interpreter equals GVP 815, which matches the capability that we created earlier. If you happen to have an IVR profile configured that you want to use the old legacy interpreter, well, basically you will be adding that for GVP 814 for that. Just a quick note, so when you are using legacy interpreter, you do have to make sure that the voice XML application module is the old legacy one. So you can update your things manually by setting it to this, or in the wizard, you select legacy GVP from the drop-down box. We're getting close. Close to the end. So the last couple sections is high availability, followed by Linux. So I'm just going to go over this fairly quickly. So this is High Availability Resource Manager for 2008. Basically, you add the feature for 2008. This stuff is fairly similar for 2003, at least for the configuration part. Create a new cluster. Make sure that this uses a local area connection that will only be used for NLB, so this won't be used for anything else. So all of our other connections will be on connection 1. This is my resource manager server that I'm using. Priority, which is basically just a unique identifier, will be associated with the cluster member ID that will be configured in each RM, so either 1 or 2. This is the virtual IP I will be using. So I'm using a v4 address, so it's .10. Make sure that we've got unicast mode set for this. And in the next page, you basically make sure that your entire port range from 0 to 65K using both UDP and TCP for multiple hosts are included in this NLB cluster. And then you add your second host. And so now we have my 2 resource managers. I've actually installed the second one the same way that I installed the first one. So my dedicated NLB IPs are .13 and .14, which will be used with a virtual IP of .10. I've got 2 separate IPs that we'll be using for intra-cluster communication, which are .11 and 12 accordingly. Once you've actually got your NLB set up, 2003, as I mentioned, is basically the same, although I think you actually have to manually configure all that port stuff from port 0 to 65K rather than have it set by default. So the cluster high availability mode should be active standby. Active is if you're using load balancers. Hot standby should be set to true. This basically allows the RMs to send information about existing calls to each other, so that if one takes over from the other, then it will have all this information. It will know about basically previous calls. Member 1 and member 2, these are the IP and port that the resource managers use to talk to each other and make sure that the other resource manager is actually up. The port is typically listed as 9801 in our deployment guide, but it can be pretty much anything you want. In fact, your 2 ports listening by both of them don't even have to be the same, just as long as they're configured the same on each RM. So you could have port 9801 here and 9802 here, and make sure that both resource manager configurations have that 9801 and 2. Again, this is the non-NLB IP. So .13 and .14 were what we used for NLB, so that is not going to be used here. Cluster members are 1 and 2, and basically each resource manager will get a member ID of either 1 or 2. Just to note that this doesn't use the typical framework active backup, which you can switch over. If member ID 2 is up, then it will be the active one. Pretty much always, unless something's wrong with NIC detection. Again, you fill in the virtual IP. You might as well leave this as true, which will include the actual virtual IP in your VIA header. The other section is GVP NICs. You have to fill in these values, 0 and 1. It's more filling these in. You also do the same for Linux, but you can specify which actual ETH NICs you're using. You fill in the MAC 1 and 2 for detection to make sure that these NICs are actually up. The resource manager will look at all the NICs if this is not set. And if you happen to have, say, 5 NICs and one of them's down, it will consider something's wrong, and it will not try and take over an active role if that's the case. So specify the MACs for the actual NICs you want to listen or want to monitor. Just note that one of the MACs will be the NLB MAC, which will be modified by the actual Windows NLB process itself. So set up NLB first and then set the MACs. So this is an example of my configuration. Note I'm using 11 and 12 here, not 13 and 14. There's my virtual IP, and this is the NLB created MAC. You also have to modify your NLB BAT files, and in BAT files, the actual files are descriptive, so it tells you what to set. But there are basically 5 parameters, so you set your virtual IP to whatever it is. You set the private member IPs if you're using Windows 2008. If not, you use or leave the configurations default as 1 and 2. If you're using Windows 2003, the WLBS password you blank out if you're using 2008, which I should note that if you're using 2008, the Resource Manager service should have administrative rights because you don't have a password to fill in here. 2003 is different. You actually fill in the password, and you can start your RM as pretty much anything you want. And the member ID will correspond to the member ID you actually set earlier with my member ID. So these will be set slightly differently for each different RM. These are the things that if you decide to do, if you've decided to wait till the end to set up your high availability RMs, so basically you go back and update your SIP server VMs to use a new IP. You have to create a second gateway LRG. As I mentioned before, gateway LRGs, it's 1 gateway LRG per RM. So if you have 2, you create 2 basically identical gateway LRGs, but with each RM specified as the owner. You will have to recreate the MCP, CCP, and CTI logical resource groups, as you can't sort of add in new RMs. And don't forget to change the capability requirement if you have set that. And of course, you have to update your MCPs and your CCPs with the route set and the media controller parameters. Just a quick note on testing. So as I mentioned before, the RM should be run with an administrative account, so it can control the NLB. And a quick way to test this is you will start up the RM1, which, as I mentioned before, will always be the backup, or RM2 will always be the primary, so RM1 will always be the backup unless the primary is actually not running. So we'll start off the member ID 1, which is the backup, make sure it can handle calls. We then start up RM2, which will take over as primary, always make sure that it is now handling calls as opposed to the old backup one. And then we stop member ID 2 again and make sure that the backup takes over. So this will cover pretty much all the scenarios of failover. If there is a problem with NIC monitoring, then one of these will not take over handling calls in steps 2 and 3. The RM will actually handle calls if it's by itself, if there's no other RMs that it can detect at the very start, but if something takes over from it, then it will not take back over. So this sort of might work when you initially start it up if NIC monitoring isn't sort of working properly, but after that, things will go wrong. As I mentioned before, basically the resource manager controls active backup by itself, so these will both be listed as primary. You can't change these over, and you should not add one RM as the backup object to another. I'm just going to briefly go over high availability. I'm going to skip one section on here. So there's two different versions of high availability for the reporting server, segregated versus shared. With segregated, each reporting server has its own JMS data store, and if one reporting server goes down and the second one takes over, it will not have access to the old reporting server's JMS data store, which means that the stuff that the reporting server hasn't processed will not be put in the database until the that particular reporting server comes back online. It's generally good enough for most people, but if you happen to have or happen to require up to the second reporting stuff in your database, then you can move on to a shared high availability reporting server in which you use Windows clustering to share a drive that has the data store. So when one reporting server takes over from the other, it's still using the exact same JMS data store, which means that all the data will be there pretty much right away. I'm just going to briefly talk about the segregated version first. Basically, you just install a second reporting server, and then you add that second reporting server as a backup for the first one, and that's it. It's nice, simple. Unlike the resource manager, you'll notice there is a primary and a backup, and you can use the switchover button to switch to backup and primary. So basically, if you want to make or clear out the queue that hadn't been processed after an incident, you just click on switchover, and it should, once it switches back, it should be golden. So I am going to skip over the shared section as it's a bit convoluted and probably not really used all that much, but basically we use clustered administration to set up a cluster that has shared disks and shared IPs and a shared application object. If you're really interested, you can get the slide deck and read through it. It's fairly straightforward. The last section is Linux. So as you may have noticed, we've pretty much been talking about Windows for pretty much everything. For the most part, Linux installation is exactly the same as Windows installation. Deployment's the same, configuration's pretty much the same. There are a few things I thought I'd mention. By default, etc hosts generally associates the actual host name with 127.0.0.1. So we do suggest that you actually associate it with the proper host name. If you are using non-root user for your resource manager in high availability, we suggest you use bonding. In that GVP NICs section we mentioned earlier that the MAC address is set for Windows for monitoring NICs. On this, we actually reference the file. So it's the procnet bonding bond 0 file if you have bonding. and pretty much anyone can read this file, even non-root users. However, if you're not using bonding, the resource manager has to use an IOCTL function call, which is root only, which means it won't be able to detect whether or not your next rep, which means failover, will again go wrong. The steps are pretty much the same, so you create an alias network instead of setting up NLB. You configure the cluster and GVP sections as we saw before. You modify your NLB bat and init shell scripts, basically following instructions in them. There's only 2 parameters really to set this time. If you're using Red Hat 5, you have to copy over the IFUP and the IFUP ETH scripts that are in your etc sysconfig network scripts directory. The one that the resource manager comes with by default is Red Hat 4. That's already pre-modified. But this one, so if you've Red Hat 5, then you have to copy over that version because it's slightly different for the network scripts. You do have to edit them. This will basically allow the resource manager to start up the alias NIC without sending ART queries to make sure that no one else has taken this particular IP address. Make sure those scripts are executable, and then there's a whole section in the deployment guide about alarm reaction scripts. Basically, with Windows NLB, the scripts will enable itself and disable the other system, so it actually has control over both systems, whereas with Linux, it only has control of itself. So if the RM happens to crash and the other one takes over, unless the actual whole server has gone down, that aliased virtual IP will still be up on the old server, and it will also be up on the new server that's taking over. And so there has to be a way of stopping that particular, or shutting down that interface. And that's what these alarm reaction scripts do. Also for Linux, for non-root MCPs, when you deploy, you basically have to make sure that this directory exists and is writable to by whatever particular user you're using. So simple way is you make the directory, you change the ownership of it to whatever, using this example as Genesis user. And you should also increase the security limits to increase the file descriptor limit. Basically, the media platform will try and increase it to 12,000. And if it's not root, you can't do that. So set it yourself beforehand. And we're basically done now. So last couple slides, the other resources. So there are various workshops available through Genesis University. Our tech support site has many different solutions that you can search for stuff. The next tutorial will be in February on business care features and benefits. And if you have any questions, comments, or whatever, you can send it to support@genesislab.com. And now I guess we're ready for questions. So I believe Susie,
Thank
can
you.
you open up the line for questions?
Certainly, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to register a question, please press the 1 followed by the 4 on your telephone. You will hear a 3-tone prompt to acknowledge your request. If your question has been answered and you would like to withdraw your registration, please press the 1 followed by the 3. If you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before entering your request. One moment, please, for your first question. Our first question coming from the line of Aaron Duquette. Please proceed with your question.
So I noticed when your demonstration for the network load balancer for Microsoft, that all your IP addresses for the private, the dedicated, and the virtual addresses were on the same subnet. Is there some mechanism in 815 that overcomes the network flooding problem when you have your dedicated and your private IP addresses in the same subnet?
Off the top of my head, I suspect the answer is no. I'll have to look into that.
All right, that's fair.
Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to register for a question, please press the 1 followed by the 4. One moment, please. Mr. Jones, there are no further questions at this time. I'll now turn the call. Oh, I'm sorry. We do have a question from Mr. Duquette again. Please complete your question.
Hi there. Are we going to, for those of us who registered, are we going to get copies of the slides, or are they available on a link?
I believe they're made available through links, including the actual recording itself. That should be up in a couple of days after this is completed.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question coming from the line of Rick Ray. Please proceed with your question.
Yes. Is there any difference between Red Hat 5 and going to Red Hat 6?
As an official tech support person, we technically don't actually support Red Hat 6, but I have seen customers use it, and there shouldn't really be any problems or differences with it.
Okay, thank you.
But technically, you're not supposed to be using it.
So it's unsupported?
Officially, yes.
Thank you. Our next question coming from the line of Andrei Yarosheyak. Please proceed with your question.
Hi. Do you know if we could use two independent reporting servers, completely independent, working with different databases, similar to what we have a redundancy mode for interaction concentrator? So there would be two reporting servers working with two different databases, and we would have two connections from MCP to one and to another.
That is nothing I've heard about, so I believe that wouldn't be supported.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, there are no further questions at this time. I'll now turn the call back to you.
Well, if there are no further questions, I think all the stuff in the Q&A chat's been answered. Let's try if we have any comments. I believe then we can close this call down. Thank you all for participating, and as mentioned not too long ago, this should be up on the web on our support site in, I think, a few days.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the conference call for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines. Have a great day.